Hello, Kiran.
Hello, Patricia. Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting and it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
So I'm going to present you. So Kiran Krishna es un microbiólogo investigador que tiene pues muchísimos años, prácticamente 20 años en todo lo que es el mercado de los suplementos y de la nutrición. Realmente él tiene pues gran experiencia en lo que es el tema del desarrollo y la investigación en el campo de la medicina molecular y de la microbiología en la Universidad de Iowa. Dejó la universidad para tomar posiciones de liderazgo en compañías globales para el desarrollo de productos. Y pues recientemente Kiran es el cofundador y el jefe científico de Microbiome Lab. Para los que no lo conocen, Microbiome Lab es un líder en el tema de microbioma y de investigación sobre probióticos. Realmente es uno de los productos estrellas que nosotros en la clínica utilizamos. Pues también es una persona, un presentador, speaker en muchísimas conferencias sobre el microbioma humano y también conferencias sobre nutrición y medicina. También ha sido invitado a nivel de programas de radio, de muchos summits de salud. Y también está involucrado en este momento en investigaciones clínicas, en 18 investigaciones clínicas sobre probióticos y microbioma humano. Y pues también es, por si eso fuera poco, también es asesor científico de 7 compañías en la industria. Pues también tiene muchísimas publicaciones. So Kiran Krishna is a research microbiologist and has been involved in the dietary supplement and nutrition market for the past 20 years. He comes from a strict research background, having spent several years with hands-on research and development in the fields of molecular medicine and microbiology at the University of Iowa. He's the co-founder and the chief scientific officer at Microbiome Lab, a leader in microbiome and probiotic research. He's a frequent lecturer on the human microbiome at medical and nutrition conference, and he's also an expert guest on national radio and satellite radio, and has been a guest speaker on several health summits as a microbiome expert. So, thank you, Julian. You can start because it's very a lot of information.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Patricia, and Karen. Thank you so much for the help in getting all of this set up. First, let me say lo siento. I apologize. I do not speak Spanish, which I wish I did. And so, unfortunately, I'll have to do this talk in English. And but I understand. I think most of you probably understand English very well. But if for some reason there are terminologies that I use that are more local or colloquial that don't make sense, please put in the chat so I can make sure that everything is clear in terms of the messaging. Let me start by sharing my slides. And when I speak, I'll typically turn off my camera because I make a lot of weird faces when I speak, so I don't want to be distracted. I don't want you to be distracted by that. So I'm very excited to be able to do this presentation for you today. Everywhere around the world, people are concerned about weight. Virtually the global community struggles with weight issues. And beyond the idea of wanting to look nice, the big problem with weight is it really creates a significant amount of risk for all other chronic illnesses. We're seeing that now with COVID, for example. We know that in the US and in some of the global data, that people who are obese or overweight, who have metabolic syndrome, people who have type 2 diabetes, all of these individuals have anywhere from 4 to 6 times higher rate of mortality than individuals that don't suffer from metabolic syndrome. So there's a significant vulnerability and risk for other chronic illnesses when you have metabolic dysfunction or excessive weight. So what the idea behind this is to really understand at the root level how weight is determined in the body, how your body responds to food, and what role the microbiome plays in dictating whether or not you are lean or whether or not you struggle with weight and metabolic issues all the time. I think the first thing to notice, and this is US data, but I think globally the data is very similar in that, metabolic and obesity prevalence continues to increase year over year, and it's projected to continue to increase. And the troubling thing is that we're seeing the same thing in our kids as well, right? Pediatric or infant or child obesity is a major problem globally, as it is in the US as well. So there certainly couldn't be more clear that obesity continues to be a significant problem globally. And yet, on top of that, we still spend so much money on obesity and obesity-related solutions. If you look at the US population, we're just over 314 million people, and about 251 million of those are 15 years old or older. And of that, about 173 million people in that category are overweight or obese. And yet almost 93 million people report themselves as being dieting, right? So we've got this significant discrepancy between what people are reporting as far as what they're doing for weight management and then the actual results of weight management. You see that on a global scale as well, where you see a huge market and a significant amount of spending. As of 2014, 6 years ago, the global market for obesity was about $700 billion. So there's no shortage of money being spent on weight management, weight loss solutions, dieting, and so on. And yet we're not really seeing any of the results. And of course, this chart illustrates the same thing. This is specific, I believe, to the United States, where we see a significant spending, about $65 billion a year being spent on weight-related industry within the U.S. itself. So then the big question is, all of these decades, all of these years, we've been spending more and more on obesity-related solutions. There's been more and more research coming out. There are more solutions than you could ever imagine between diet programs, exercise at home, pills, surgery, all of these things. And yet we are not seeing any success when it comes to obesity and metabolic syndrome. So what is really the missing link here? Because there's something we're clearly missing out on that isn't being addressed, because despite all the money, we're not seeing the success. And as we've learned over the last 7 to 8 years, that perhaps one of the key parts of this missing link is the role of the microbiome in weight management. Now, some of this information started coming about 8 years ago, as I mentioned, when they did studies on what we call discordant twins. So these are identical twins who have exactly the same genetics. So they're 100% same genetics. They're identical twins, but they're discordant, meaning that one twin is lean and the other twin has ended up growing up to be obese. When they take the microbiomes from the obese and the lean twin, and then they transplant it into genetically identical mice, what they find is the mice that have the implant, the microbiome implant from the obese twin tends to gain weight, and the one from the slim twin tends to stay slim despite eating the same exact amount of food each day, right? And then they've shown that they can switch that around, where then they can use antibiotics, wipe out the microbiome in the obese mouse, transplant in the slim twins microbiome, and then this mouse will start to lose weight and vice versa. This particular type of experiment has been done many times through using many different iterations, and always we find that when you introduce an obese microbiome into a normal weight animal, that normal weight animal, despite no change in diet, will start gaining weight and show metabolic syndrome. right? So it's clear that the microbiome has some role in this, right? We don't know at that point, we don't know to say that it's the absolute cause of it, but it certainly plays a significant role. Now, this has been demonstrated in humans as well. There's been a couple of cases for fecal transplants and in fact, this has been shown a couple of different times where one individual who was lean and lean all her life had ulcerative colitis and got a fecal transplant from a donor. And the fecal transplant actually helped the ulcerative colitis. But within a few weeks of that transplant, that lean individual started gaining weight for the first time in her life. And she had never suffered from weight-associated conditions. In fact, she was quite active and quite a bit of an athlete. And so then when they look back to the donor is actually overweight. And now that overweight phenotype has been transplanted into this new individual. So it's clear that the microbiome plays a significant role. Now, when you look at the microbiome as it relates to obesity, there are some key signatures within the microbiome that are very closely associated with obesity. So the first thing is dysbiosis, right? Dysbiosis is a very general term, but the dysbiotic gut happens when the gut microbiome is imbalanced, which ultimately leads into permeability. Right, one of the critical roles of the microbiota, in the gut especially, is to maintain integrity of the barrier structure, right? The mucosa, the intestinal epithelium. If it maintains the integrity of the barrier structure, the microbiota is doing a large part of its job. One of the things that occurs when you have dysbiosis is you end up with intestinal permeability. And I'll talk about why that's important as well and show you some research. Now, increase or decrease in specific bacterial groups, functional groups of bacteria, lead to this idea of dysbiosis. It's not as much singular bacteria, but it's more certain groups of bacteria. Although in the case of obesity, there are a few singular species that seem to play a very critical role. Dysbiosis is also then associated with GI conditions like inflammatory bowel disease or Clostridium difficile, autoimmune disorders, and of course, obesity and so on. And so dysbiosis within the gut microbiome and then the resulting permeability is a major driver of all kinds of conditions, including obesity. Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes are two of the largest phylum within the gut microbiota. So somewhere around 90% of all bacteria in your gut microbiota will fall either into the Firmicutes or Bacteroidetes phylum. And this ratio of Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes can be predictive of obesity. People that tend to have more Firmicutes than the average compared to Bacteroidetes will tend to have dysbiosis associated with obesity, and vice versa. If Bacteroidetes is elevated above the average compared especially to Firmicutes, then the individual tends to stay lean for the rest of their lives and not really struggle with weight. So that's one of the characteristics of an obese microbiome. And diet can alter the microbiome quite significantly and alters the community and throws off this equilibrium, right? So what you eat matters significantly, not as much from the caloric standpoint, but more so from the perspective of how it impacts the microbiome. Right, so dysbiosis occurs secondary from the Western diet. So when you look at a high protein, sugar, and fat diet, because the diet will increase the number of Firmicutes. And when you have an increased level of Firmicutes, you tend to have metabolic distress. And there's a few different reasons for that. We'll get into that reason in the next few slides. But there is a signature for what looks like a obese-related microbiome. Other features of a microbiome as it relates to obesity, there are commensal bacteria that are incredibly important in protecting the individual, the host, from not only obesity, but everything under the cardiometabolic syndrome spectrum. One of those really important organisms, and we call these kind of organisms keystone strains. So one of those really important organisms is one called Akkermansia muciniphila. Akkermansia muciniphila is inversely associated with obesity, diabetes, cardiometabolic disease, and low-grade inflammation. If you look at the gut microbiomes of people that tend to stay lean for most of their lives and don't struggle with weight, aren't high risk for diabetes, don't have cardiovascular disease, they tend to have high levels of akkermansia. And exactly the opposite, when you have low levels of akkermansia, the risk and the prevalence rate of obesity and metabolic syndrome goes way up. Akkermansia is a mucin-degrading commensal anaerobe. So it's an anaerobic bacteria that lives in the large bowel. It's an obligate anaerobe, so it can't actually leave the body and come back in. The moment it gets exposed to oxygen, it starts degenerating or decomposing. And it's been demonstrated to actually reverse high-fat diet-induced fat mass gain. This is in animal studies, and adipose tissue inflammation and insulin resistance. So in grafting obese and metabolic syndrome mice who are fed a very high-fat diet, in grafting them or implanting in them akkermansia actually starts to reverse the impact of the poor high-fat diet and sedentary lifestyle. It actually reverses the fat mass gain, it reverses the adipose tissue inflammation, and it reverses the insulin resistance as well. But it requires live viable microbes. So the idea of trying to use akkermansia as a probiotic has been tested, but it doesn't work. But there's other ways of increasing akkermansia, which is exciting. Another couple of different species or genuses that are really important. Bifidobacteria in the distal colon is really important because bifidobacteria is also inversely correlated with body weight in humans and in animals, especially a particular species called Bifidobacterium animalis. Animalis is quite specific for metabolic related issues. In mice who are fed a high-fat diet, viable levels of Bifidobacteria administration was shown to reduce liver triglycerides, total cholesterol, total lipid depositions, and body weight gain. So again, in a challenge environment where you induce metabolic syndrome, high levels of free fatty acids, and then all of the classical characteristics of metabolic syndrome like dyslipidemia, elevated triglycerides, all of those things, you can actually reverse those metabolically by just engrafting or implanting or increasing the growth of some of these key species like Bifidobacteria animalis. It's also a very efficient producer of CLA, conjugated linoleic acid. CLA has a tremendous impact on beta oxidation or fat metabolism in the body. So that CLA production by Bifidobacteria actually helps with fat burning in the body. It increases the production of short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are butyrate, propionate, and acetate that are produced in the large intestine and are really critical for metabolic homeostasis. I'll provide a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides, but short-chain fatty acids work through certain receptors like GLP-1. And we'll talk again about what that might do. Lactobacillus species actually can be quite important for metabolic health as well. They've been also shown to be able to reduce fat mass in mice in a similar way as in akkermansia and bifidobacteria. They also produce conjugated linoleic acid as a way of encouraging fat burn, and it's been able to show both fat burn in animals and in humans. And in humans tend to have low levels of CLA production naturally, and we're dependent on dietary sources. But commensal lactobacillus provides substantial amounts of CLA for metabolism of linoleic acid. So all we have to do is get adequate amounts of linoleic acid into our diet, and then the lactobacilli in our gut will actually conjugate it to CLA, to conjugated linoleic acid. Now, the one issue is that dietary CLAs, if you take CLA's actual conjugated linoleic acid as a dietary supplement, it gets mainly absorbed in the small bowel. So therefore, most of the large intestine CLA must be generated by colonic microbiota. So it becomes really important to not just supplement with CLA, because CLA, for a period of time, was a really popular dietary supplement in the US industry, especially as it relates to weight loss. But what the studies find is that you're absorbing most of that in your small bowel, and the large bowel CLA, where the receptors are to bind CLA, are actually not getting enough of this compound, and you actually need to produce it in the intestine. So viable levels of lactobacilli are a major producer of colonic CLA, and of course Bifidobacterium as well. CLA also has an impact on reducing inflammation and intestinal permeability, as it's associated with obesity as well. And remember, I mentioned intestinal permeability becomes a significant issue as it relates to obesity and metabolic health. Other components of the microbiome that are really important in maintaining a healthy metabolism are postbiotics, right? So postbiotics that protect against obesity are really powerful tools that the microbiome uses to impact our metabolic health. One of the most well-studied categories of postbiotics for metabolic health are short-chain fatty acids, things like butyrate, acetate, and propionate. These are the byproducts of gut microbial fermentation. They strengthen the intestinal barrier and enhance the colon health. Bacteria in the gut make use of undigested polysaccharides, resistant starches, oligosaccharides, and then they ferment them and create short-chain fatty acids in the large bowel. Major end products of this fermentation, of course, are acetate, propionate, butyrate. Somewhere around a 60-20-20 ratio is what you typically get. Acetate, interestingly enough, is a really important antimicrobial and maintains certain balance within the microbiome. But there's a number of species that will then convert acetate to propionate and then propionate to butyrate and so on. So short-chain fatty acids were suggested to lower pH and then alter the colonic microbiota. But they increase mucosal resistance against bacteria that are pathogenic to the body. Part of the reason is that butyrate, for example, is a really important fuel for goblet cells. Goblet cells are cells sitting in your intestinal epithelium, and they produce mucin. They're the ones that produce the mucosal structure, and they require butyrate as an energy source in order to be able to produce mucin. So just that reproduction of mucin provides this nice barrier structure in the intestinal mucosa, both in the large and small intestine, and that provides resistance against pathogens that may be trying to invade. And certain pathogens are classically associated with obesity. Increased production of both butyrate and acetate tend to be associated with a leaner body mass. Short-chain fatty acids act as signaling molecules, so they interact with things called G-protein coupled receptors, abbreviated GPR. The main ones are GPR41 and 43. These are expressed both on adipocytes and on intestinal epithelium. GPR41, when it binds the short-chain fatty acids from the microbiota, it activates the stimulation of leptin production, right? And leptin is absolutely critical for satiety signaling. And leptin counteracts ghrelin, ghrelin being the hunger hormone. So if you've got patients, and most of the patients that are struggling with weight, they tend to struggle with the issue of overeating. Overeating basically is driven by an overproduction of ghrelin and an underproduction of leptin, right? So the hunger hormone remains elevated despite taking in adequate amounts of calories. Now, when you have adequate amounts of calories, you're supposed to feel satiated and stop eating. But if ghrelin, the hunger hormone levels, remain high, it becomes really hard to stop eating. So what's supposed to happen when you eat your first few bites of food, as they move through the digestive system, some of that will get converted into short-chain fatty acids by the beneficial bacteria. Those short-chain fatty acids start binding the G-protein coupled receptors in the intestinal epithelium and on adipocytes, and that causes them to release leptin. When leptin is released, it being the satiety hormone, it counteracts the function of ghrelin. So that is supposed to stop us from continuously overeating, and it's also supposed to help us prolong the period between meals, right? So that's really an important function. Now, the other function of short-chain fatty acids is the adipocytes that contain these G-protein coupled receptors will sense intestinal short-chain fatty acid, and then they'll release something called adiponectin in response. And adiponectin is associated with the upregulation of AMPK. AMPK is an enzyme that monitors cellular energy and stimulates fat oxidation in all the peripheral tissues, right? So that's another effect of the food getting digested by the microbiota. So if you have adequate microbiota that produce short-chain fatty acids, and remember, most of those are associated with leaner individuals, higher levels of bifidobacteria, higher levels of Akkermansia, for example. As they produce the short-chain fatty acids, those short-chain fatty acids turn the satiety signals on, the leptin signals. It brings down the ghrelin, the hunger hormone signals, so you feel satiated, you stop eating at the right time, and then you don't need to eat again for some time. So you're not taking in too many calories. And then on top of that, it activates this enzyme system, the AMPK system, to increase cellular beta oxidation in all of the tissues in the body. So we're turning on fat burning throughout all of the muscular tissues, all of the connective tissues, all of the tissues in the body that require calories. Now they're turned on for beta oxidation. So now you're burning more fat. In obesity, low levels of short chain fatty acids are produced. So you get less adiponectin generated, less AMPK, which dramatically decreases the body's ability to utilize fat for fuel. So that's a inhibition of beta oxidation. And utilizing fat for fuel is a complex metabolic process. And obese individuals tend to utilize sugar much more efficiently than they can fatty acids or fat for fuel. And so then they tend to get sugar cravings a lot more because their body is dependent on sugar as a main fuel source. Now, and then also you get an influx of free fatty acid into the liver because the fats that are circulating around aren't getting burned off for energy. And when you get an increase of free fatty acids into the liver, you start seeing things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that's why non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is associated with obesity. So dyslipidemia, all of this elevated triglycerides, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a lot of that all comes from a dysfunction in activating fat burning and beta oxidation. And the microbiome is critical for activating fat burning and beta oxidation. So how does a dysfunctional microbiome lead to weight gain and metabolic disease? We already talked about some of that. I want to get a little bit deeper into this part because it's really important to understand what is going on in your patient's digestive tract that is preventing them from losing weight and that is causing them to gain more weight over time. So the first one, the primary cause of obesity is leaky gut, intestinal permeability. In a healthy gut where you have a low level of translocation of toxins, you tend to have a much more lean and metabolically healthy individual, especially one called lipopolysaccharide. In a toxic gut or leaky gut, you tend to have a high degree of translocation of toxins. That leads to a number of metabolic changes that cause metabolic dysfunction and obesity. So let me go through that a little bit. In a healthy gut, this is a schematic of what a healthy gut may look like. This is the mucosal layer, and there's two distinct areas to the mucosal layer. You've got the inner part of the mucosal layer called the mucin 2 layer. This inner part remains relatively sterile, meaning most of the microbes that live in the mucosa live in the upper part of the mucin 1 component of the mucosa. The mucin 1 component is more of a liquid component. This is a more rigid structure within the mucosa itself. Now, most of the lipopolysaccharide, and keep in mind, lipopolysaccharide is a normal part of gram-negative bacteria cellular membranes. Gram-negative bacteria make up somewhere around 60 to 70% of all of the microbes within the microbiota. So you've got lots of LPS being generated, and as cells turn over and they die, this LPS is released into the lumen. So in the lumen, the LPS is not really causing any problems. In fact, LPS in the lumen, if you have a healthy immune system, can be quite important for stimulating the intestinal immune cells like L cells and M cells. However, if LPS is allowed to leak through and enter circulation, that's when you get problems. So the microbiome prevents this by maintaining this important barrier structure. The features of the microbiome that maintain this barrier structure are things like high diversity in the microbiome. The higher your diversity, the better the barrier structure and the more lean you are. And then the presence of protective strains. We talked about keystone strains like Akkermansia. Other ones are Faecalibacteria prausnitzii or Rhumnococcus bromai. These are really important protective keystone strains that maintain this whole barrier structure. One of the ways that they do that is they produce these short chain fatty acids like we've talked about. And as I mentioned, goblet cells that produce the mucin require butyrate, one of the key short chain fatty acids. Butyrate and other short-chain fatty acids also minimize inflammation in this part of the mucosa. It reduces recruitment of innate immune cells, so you don't get inflammatory responses to food particles and things like that. So it plays a really important role in minimizing inflammatory damage as well. And then finally, you need well-formed tight junctions in between all of the intestinal epithelial cells so that you can allow for paracellular transport of nutrients, but it stays tight and shut, not allowing things like bacteria, bacterial toxins, and so on to leak through. Now, the expression of tight junction proteins, and there are about 40 or so tight junction proteins, the expression of tight junction proteins is actually stimulated by the microbiota itself. So certain species within the gut microbiota actually increase the expression of tight junction protein to seal up the gut lining. Now, when the gut is dysfunctional, this is more of what it looks like. You've got dysfunctional bacteria in the lumen that start to eat away at this inner part of the mucosa. They start to digest the inner part of the mucosa. That causes an influx of the top layer of the mucosa to the inner area close to the intestinal epithelium. That means you're getting large amounts of translocation of bacteria, viruses, food particles, toxins from the outside environment, and so on, translocating to this inner part near the intestinal epithelium. Now, the intestinal epithelium, as I mentioned, has immune cells embedded in it, like L cells and M cells. When they sense things like LPS or viruses and bacteria getting too close to the intestinal epithelium, the thinking among this immune cell is that we are now experiencing a potential septicemia or bacteremia, right? So it becomes a very serious condition for the intestinal epithelium. So what they do is they recruit innate immune cells into this region to elicit massive inflammatory immune defense systems. Now, when they do that, it damages the intestinal epithelium, as inflammation does, and then you start losing the intestinal epithelial cells. They don't turn over as fast, and then you also start opening gaps in between the cells. So now things like LPS that's typically found in the lumen is allowed to leak through and is now found in the circulation or the basolateral circulation here on the inside, right? So now you've got translocation of LPS into circulation. This is defined as metabolic endotoxemia or postprandial endotoxemia. So if your patients have leaky gut, if they have a dysfunctional gut because of antibiotic use, the exposure to things like Roundup, glyphosate, herbicides, pesticides, drinking contaminated water or drinking water overabundant with chlorine and fluoride, if they have an overuse of antibiotics, if they're eating foods that tend to have lots of preservatives and chemical compounds in it, all of those things over time can create dysbiosis that leads to this disruption in the mucosa and then this leaky gut-like conformation. So imagine this is what sections of your patient's gut looks like every time they eat food, and this is the lumen up here. As food moves through the lumen and the digestive process is occurring, you've got bile being released, you've got antimicrobials being released, you've got stomach acid, pancreatic enzymes, all of those things, and just the bolus of food moving through, all of that causes bacterial die-off and release of more LPS. So the process of eating itself causes a release of LPS in the lumen. And if the gut looks like this, it's leaky, a lot of that LPS is going to end up in circulation, and you can measure that, right? Or at least you can in the research environment. So that is why it's called metabolic endotoxemia, because metabolic indicating that the endotoxemia is associated with the metabolic process or the digestion of food. So now when we look at metabolic endotoxemia or leaky gut, we see that it's characterized by a sharp increase in serum lipopolysaccharide levels postprandially. Typically, the peak reaches at about 5 hours after the meal. Now, metabolic endotoxemia, when LPS enters circulation, it is followed by the activation of something called toll-like receptor 4 CD14 immune response. and it creates chronic low-grade inflammation. Metabolic endotoxemia is associated with a dysbiotic microbiome and is caused by a disrupted intestinal barrier. It is self-perpetuating problem, meaning when one section of the gut is leaky, all of the inflammatory response that's going on in that section actually causes adjacent sections to become damaged and leaky as well. And lipopolysaccharide itself causes an increase in intestinal tight junction permeability. So just the presence of LPS in the intestinal epithelium will create dysfunctions in tight junctions, thereby opening up the intestinal epithelium even more. So LPS translocation is the biggest driver of intestinal permeability and then eventually of something called metabolic endotoxemia. So now let's look at the impact of that. Number of studies, this one done by the American Diabetic Association, has shown that metabolic endotoxemia initiates obesity and insulin resistance. It's not present because of insulin resistance and obesity. It actually is the process that initiates the formation of obesity and insulin resistance. It is the root cause. When you look also at studies that show the incubation of LPS, so this is the incubation of LPS with adipocytes. And this is a control. This is with high fat. And then you see the presence of LPS. What it tends to do is it swells the adipocyte. So it actually increases the volume of the fat cells. So it can dramatically change volumetrically what the fat cells look like. There's a number of other effects that LPS has. For example, LPS from the gut can induce low-grade inflammation, which increases the hypothalamic J and K expression, and this causes central insulin resistance, which is irrespective of body weight changes. You know, certainly in the US, I don't know if you're seeing the same in your part of the world, where we're seeing younger and younger individuals coming in and presenting with type 2 diabetes, and they are of normal body weight often. So what is happening is that LPS can actually get to the brain and create central insulin resistance in the brain, where the brain no longer can read the blood sugar levels, right? So that's a very scary proposition, that the brain is being affected in such a way that it cannot assess the appropriate blood sugar levels. The pancreas is working fine, the islet cells are working fine, but the brain cannot read the blood sugar levels. Here's another large-scale study. This is called the CardioPrev study. This was a study of 462 patients over 60 months. They followed all of these patients that were deemed to be at increased risk for developing type 2 diabetes, and they followed all kinds of markers in these patients to understand what markers would be the most predictive of the development of type 2 diabetes. They found that there was only one marker, plasma levels of LPS, that was a predictor of type 2 diabetes. In fact, they suggest that that should be a predictor that is developed to measure the risk for type 2 diabetes. So there's one marker among all of the inflammatory markers and things that we have access to measure. One marker predicts the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. That's how much LPS you have in your plasma. One of the other problems that LPS drives is this idea of leptin resistance. You know, we talked about earlier how important leptin is in order to be able to combat the hunger messaging from ghrelin. Leptin is, of course, the satiety hormone. But one of the problems that has been shown through research is that LPS can accumulate in the hypothalamus and trigger an inflammatory cascade. So it's creating inflammation in the brain. And if LPS reaches the vagal afferent nerve, it can damage the nerve, resulting in leptin and insulin resistance. Again, inhibiting the communication between the gut and the brain. Another thing that LPS can do in the vagal nerve, and this is in the dorsal vagal complex, if LPS triggers inflammation in the dorsal vagal complex, it actually stops or slows down bowel movement. So the peristaltic activity and the migrating motor complex of the small and large bowel gets arrested because LPS is now creating inflammation in the central nervous system at the brainstem. right? So same thing with leptin resistance and can drive insulin resistance as well. And then that, of course, leads to ghrelin dysfunction because you don't have leptin counteracting the function of the hunger hormone ghrelin. So you start to get these constant elevated levels of ghrelin and the absence or dysfunction of leptin that leads to chronic overeating. So when you look at microbiome, obesity, and metabolic disease, metabolic endotoxemia induces obesity and diabetes, right? So metabolic endotoxemia is at the root cause of this entire problem, which means we have to stop metabolic endotoxemia if we want to have any chance of helping our patients and consumers reach their weight and health goals. So metabolic endotoxemia has to be paid attention to. Increased levels of circulating LPS can cause insulin resistance, both through central insulin resistance, and then it also there's evidence that it can cause inflammation of the pancreas as well. It causes morphological changes and swelling of the adipocytes, and it can actually enter into the enteric nervous system and cause leptin resistance by disrupting the metabolic signals from the gut to the brain. And again, this is all a self-perpetuating problem because when one section of your gut is leaky, eventually what happens is the adjacent sections become leaky as well. And over time, the larger and larger percentage of the bowel actually becomes leaky. So this is just an overall schematic to show you the impact. You can have things like diets, antibiotics, things that alter the gut microbiome. One of the things that can get altered when the gut microbiome is altered, as I mentioned, is a change in short-chain fatty acid production. When you have a reduction or a change in short-chain fatty acid production, you get modulation of hormone balance within the gut, especially as it relates to leptin and the activation of GLP-1. And then, of course, that affects satiety, as we talked about, which can lead to obesity, metabolic syndrome. You also have metabolic endotoxemia, elevated LPS, which can cause swelling of adipocytes, which can also further screw up leptin and ghrelin function and cause ghrelin overload and leptin resistance. It can actually create insulin resistance, so you have blood sugar balance issues. And then, of course, there's another component to it of bile acid metabolism. Because one of the things that occurs when you have dysbiosis in the small intestine, you'll actually get bile acids conjugated and forming secondary bile salts more frequently than it should. So that means that the secondary bile salts formed in the small intestine move into the large intestine, which can cause dysbiosis in the large intestine. But the other thing it does is it doesn't allow for the activation of something called the FXR nuclear receptor. That is present in the ileum in the small bowel, and it requires non-conjugated bile salts and non-secondary bile salts to activate it. But when you have a lot of bile acid metabolism going on in the small bowel by dysbiotic bacteria, you're going to get a arrested activation of the FXR nuclear receptor, which also then disrupts lipid and glucose homeostasis, because of course, part of absorbing lipids requires activated bile in there as well. So this just gives you an overall schematic. There are a number of other mechanisms where the microbiome can drive metabolic dysfunction. Now, big question, can probiotics be used, for example, for metabolic health and weight management? And you know, this meta-analysis published in, I believe, 2016 showed that yes, there's a number of trials that have shown that probiotics themselves can be effective in supporting weight management, supporting metabolic health, but it tends to be quite specific, and we can go through that a little bit. So here's a few examples of Lactobacillus gasseri and Lactobacillus rhamnosus that were able to demonstrate weight, fat mass, and BMI reduction in a double-blind placebo-controlled study. This was published in 2010, 2013, so that's promising. Other types of studies have been shown in the ability to improve metabolic symptoms, insulin sensitivity, and inflammation, and short-chain fatty acid production. And then there's a number of studies on bifidobacteria and some lactobacilli, also some fructooligosaccharides on metabolic improvements, but this was mostly in individuals that already had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or diabetes itself. So in a sick population, they were showing that you can improve some of the metabolic response by bringing in things like lactobacillus, streptomophilus, bifidobacterium longum, lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, again, same strain here. So there is some promise in the ability to use probiotics or anything else that modulates the gut microbiome to improve metabolic response and health. Now, to us, our focus is actually targeting the root cause of obesity and metabolic disease. We think that's going to be the thing that really makes a difference in patients' lives without even having to go to really severe lifestyle changes, because we know lifestyle modifications can be really difficult, right? It's hard to take a relatively sedentary person who's eating mostly junk food and then overnight switch them to eating really healthy food, lower amount of calories, and exercising every day, right? That transition is really hard to do. So the idea is, can we start changing their microbiome first? Give them a head start so they start seeing some changes metabolically. They will feel different. They'll have different energy levels. They will see fat disappearing on their body. They will actually start to see lean muscle mass increasing, even if they're not exercising diligently. And that may be the kind of motivation they need to start making the bigger lifestyle changes. But ultimately, what we're doing is we are working on the root cause, the main issues we had talked about. So we think that this approach of targeting the root cause is likely the most powerful approach, and that is going to require something called a synbiotic. A synbiotic is a combination of a probiotic and a prebiotic, but there's a specific application for it, meaning the probiotic and prebiotic has to be demonstrated to have synergistic effect. You cannot simply combine any random probiotic with any random prebiotic and consider it to be a synbiotic. It has to show synergistic and even additive effect within the body itself. So remember, as a review, obesity is associated with low levels of bifidobacteria, low levels of Akkermansia muciniphila, low levels of certain postbiotics, especially short-chain fatty acids and CLAs. So short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, propionate, and acetate, and high levels of metabolic endotoxemia, so leakiness in the gut, right? These are the four really key characteristics. If we can fix these four things, if we can increase the level of your bifidobacteria in your large bowel, if we can increase the level of your Akkermansia muciniphila in your large bowel, if we can increase short-chain fatty acid production, if we can reduce or alleviate metabolic endotoxemia, so stop the migration of LPS from the lumen of the gut into circulation, then we should be able to achieve microbiome targeted weight loss. And again, this could be where really difficult individuals start, right? We start making these foundational changes in their gut so that their body responds differently to food. And they will start seeing improvements, is our hypothesis. I'll show you some data on that. And as they start to see improvements by making these simple changes, then that will help facilitate motivation to accelerate the change by improving their diet, improving their exercising, and so on. So that's the thinking here. So one key to making those critical changes is to utilizing the right types of prebiotics. And we need prebiotics that are what we call bifidogenic, meaning they increase the growth of bifidobacteria. So one of the key prebiotics we work with is a xylo-oligosaccharide called Pretix. And a number of studies from UCLA and other regions have shown that anywhere from 1.4 to 2.8 grams of taken per day of this particular prebiotic over a period of 7, 14, and 28 days dramatically increases the growth of bifidobacteria in individuals, right? So that is a really promising bifidogenic prebiotic. We also have found data that this particular type of prebiotic, this xylo-oligosaccharide, does also increase butyrate propionate production. Now, reduced in acetate is actually quite interesting because what that indicates is you're actually converting more of the acetate to butyrate and propionate. So that's likely why you see this drop in acetic acid. But remember, butyrate is one of the most important short-chain fatty acids. when it comes to metabolic health. So it's really promising to see that you can increase that in the microbiota just by adding in some of this xylo-oligosaccharide. Short chain fatty acid production has to also be stimulated, like we mentioned. And if you look at xylo-oligosaccharide, you tend to get the highest level of butyrate compared to other oligosaccharides that people tend to have access to, like fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides, milk oligosaccharides, and so on. The one that pushes the most butyrate production is xylo-oligosaccharides. Now, so the prebiotic can play a very important role in increasing bifidobacteria and increasing the production of short-chain fatty acids. But we also have to address metabolic endotoxemia. So we actually have published this paper in August of 2017 on metabolic endotoxemia using spore-based probiotics. So our hypothesis was the use of spore-based probiotics would dramatically improve tight junction protein expression, would increase the production of mucin, and would actually create competitive exclusion against pathogenic organisms, thereby reducing metabolic endotoxemia by sealing up the gut. And this is what we saw in our very first study. We recruited a number of patients for a simple 30-day study at University of North Texas. We would bring them in a fasted state, and we would measure their serum LPS levels in that fasted state. Most individuals would have relatively low levels, and then some would be upwards of 500 to 600 microliters per liter of LPS. But what we were looking for is, at this point, we give them a high-fat, high-caloric meal, and we're looking for this sharp increase within 5 hours of serum LPS levels. So we're looking for this metabolic endotoxemia curve. And if they had this response, that means they have leaky gut and metabolic endotoxemia, then we included them in the study. In this case, this was the pilot study where all we did was give them the probiotic, the spore-based probiotic, once a day, with no other alterations, no diet, no lifestyle alterations. And then they came back 30 days later and we did the exact same challenge, and this is the results we got afterwards. So a complete blunting of the translocation of LPS from the lumen into circulation. So the probiotic was really showing promise that it may be able to stop this leakiness in the gut and metabolic endotoxemia. And remember, metabolic endotoxemia is the driver and the cause of obesity and type 2 diabetes. Then we've also been able to show that when you alleviate metabolic endotoxemia, when you stop the leakiness in the gut, you dramatically improve ghrelin function. Because remember, leakiness in the gut and LPS translocating into the vagal nerve actually disrupts ghrelin and leptin response, right? And so what we saw here is at baseline, and this is in the treatment group, they would come in fasted, so their ghrelin levels would be high. And then we'd give them a 2,000 calorie meal here. The ghrelin levels would drop a little bit, but then again, start to increase within the first 3 hours of the meal. So this is not the classical pattern of ghrelin. Now, after 30 days of probiotics, again, nothing else, no dietary changes, nothing else. When they came back and we tested this, number one, their circulating ghrelin levels in fasted state was measurably lower than before. So their baseline ghrelin levels are lower. But then after giving them the meal, you see this dramatic and continuous drop in ghrelin, exactly how it's supposed to look. Because at this point, leptin is increasing and bringing down the hunger hormone. So this was very exciting and promising to see, because not only are we stopping the leaky gut, but we're making a fundamental change in how their body responds to food. So then we wanted to do this symbiotic study where we combined the spore-based probiotics with the prebiotics to see if there is a measurable additive or beneficial effect within the two. This is a study that we published recently. I think it was last year, maybe in 2019. I don't recall. And so what we saw in general was, when you look at butyrate production in most of these donors, when they took the symbiotic, we saw about 150% increase in butyrate production. That's a massive increase in butyrate production, and we saw it throughout the large bowel in the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon as well. And this was in a 3-week period, right? So this 3-week period, we saw a massive increase in butyrate production. which of course has huge impact on metabolic health. Bifidobacteria levels, we saw a 50 to 100% increase in bifidobacteria levels in these individuals. Despite these individuals already having pretty good bifidobacteria levels in their large bowel, we still saw a measurable increase in bifidobacteria levels, which is associated, of course, with a lean body mass. We saw a huge increase in Bacteria prosnitzi. This is another one of those keystone strains, and a strain that's really important in producing short-chain fatty acids and maintaining the barrier system within the gut. And then, of course, we saw a huge increase, 10 to 100-fold increase in Akkermansia in that 3-week period. Remember, Akkermansia is that critical metabolic protective bacteria, inversely correlated to everything under cardiometabolic syndrome, including obesity and diabetes. So we saw in our symbiotic study these really favorable changes in a 3-week period within the microbiome. And so with that in mind, we said, okay, let's do a study on obese individuals, overweight or obese women in this case. Because it's a pilot study, we kept it focused on one gender, and we gave them the combination of the prebiotic and probiotic for 90 days without making any alterations to their diet or lifestyle. So keep in mind that these are overweight and obese individuals who have really poor eating habits, who are sedentary, they don't have any exercise program, and they maintained all of those lifestyle characteristics throughout this study. The only change in their day was that they took these 2 or 3 capsules, either this or placebo, that added the spore-based probiotics and the prebiotics to their daily routine. The first thing that we saw that was really significant and very exciting was a significant decrease in visceral body fat, right? And we know that visceral body fat is the most dangerous fat. That's the fat associated with everything under metabolic syndrome. So we saw this measurable decrease in visceral fat mass, and we saw in the placebo group, not only did we not see a decrease, we of course saw an increase in the visceral fat mass in these individuals in that 3-month period. That's of course not surprising, because remember, they didn't change any of their habits. They continued to eat, they continued to have the sedentary lifestyle. They were not on any sort of diet or anything. So it's not surprising that their visceral fat mass grew over that period, compared, of course, to the treatment group that saw a 12% decrease in visceral body fat in that period. And this was all measured through DEXA analysis, which is the gold standard of measuring body composition. Other things that we saw that were really exciting is we saw a measurable decrease in cholesterol levels in these individuals. Of course, elevated cholesterol is linked with a high cardiovascular disease risk. That, of course, changed with the metabolic changes. We also saw a decrease in triglycerides. We actually have a separate published study showing very significant decrease in triglycerides in individuals that had elevated triglycerides over 200. We saw, I think it was a 38% reduction in triglycerides in 90 days. In these individuals also, we saw within the 60 and 90-day period a measurable reduction in triglyceride levels. We also saw a measurable reduction in C-peptide levels. C-peptide is an index on the quantity of insulin your body is making. So these individuals, over their 90-day period, even though they're eating the same as they did in the previous 90 days, their amount of insulin that they're producing is reduced, because they're not having the same type of hyperinsulinemia. Remember, that's because the endotoxemia, or the LPS endotoxemia, is being addressed. The increase in butyrate is helping, the increase in bifidobacteria, the increase in Akkermansia. All of those things lead to better improved insulin function. And so we're seeing that measured directly through the C-peptide levels. We also saw fasting insulin levels reduce quite dramatically as well in these individuals. So fasting elevations in insulin is linked to type 2 diabetes mellitus. So as you can see in the placebo individuals, no real change in fasting insulin levels, and in the treatment group, we saw a measurable change in fasting insulin levels. So not only are we improving fat mass, we are also improving metabolic response, and again, without changing anything. So in general, final thoughts around probiotics in weight management, and of course using the microbiome as a target. It is clear that certain probiotic strains can play a significant role in comprehensive plan to lose weight and improve metabolic health and curb metabolic disease. I think that this has to be an integral part of any patient's overall health program, right? This is metabolic dysfunction is a critical issue. When you look at diabetes alone, today, globally, there are somewhere around 3 times more pre-diabetics than diabetics. And over the next 20 years, all of those pre-diabetics are, for the most part, going to become diabetics. About 80% of them will become diabetics, and we are going to be suffering through a global epidemic of diabetes, because of course diabetes dramatically increases your risk for all other chronic illnesses. In the case of COVID, diabetics and obese individuals are the most susceptible, right? So that's a really huge burden on society to deal with this massive increase in a diabetic population. We know that metabolic endotoxemia specifically is at the root cause of diabetes. And remember the CardioPrev study, it was the most, in fact, the only marker that was able to predict the development of type 2 diabetes from pre-diabetes. So think about how important it is to take all of your pre-diabetic or early risk patients and start changing their microbiome's response to food, increasing Akkermansia, increasing bifidobacteria, increasing short-chain fatty acids, and so on. And more evidence is accumulating that you cannot achieve successful and healthy weight loss and metabolic health improvement without addressing the microbiome. The microbiome has to be part of the equation. Synbiotics will likely offer the best solution for faster realized weight management and with the ability to fundamentally change how the individual's body responds to food, right? The ghrelin response, the leptin response, the short-chain fatty acid response, all of that fundamentally changes as you change the microbiome, and all of those have a huge impact on overall metabolic health. Our work on the xylo-oligosaccharide and bacillus endospore synbiotic shows that we can repair the fundamental disruptions in the microbiome that leads to weight gain and metabolic disease. So this may offer a more sustainable solution, because unless you fix the root cause and just allow people to yo-yo diet, where they go on these crash diets or these really intense workout routines, all that's going to happen is the weight's going to come back the moment they reduce all of those behaviors, right? And that's because fundamentally in their gut, they've got an obese conformation to their microbiome. But we can change that with something as simple as a synbiotic made up of the right oligosaccharides and the right spore-based probiotics. Addressing dysbiosis and leaky gut is absolutely paramount to successful weight management. You cannot have successful weight management without addressing leaky gut, because it's the biggest inducer of metabolic syndrome. So thank you again very much. Hopefully I did not rush through that too much, and I will leave it up to Patricia and Karen if we'd like to take questions.
Perfect. So as you know, there is a question. As you know, that ketogenic diet is very popular. What do you think about, because it says that the concern about the prebiotic sources. What do you think about that? Is necessary always to supplement with prebiotics in this kind of diet?
Yeah, so I think, ketogenic diet can give you some temporary changes to your metabolic system and can provide some accelerated weight loss, right? But in some people, it doesn't work at all. And some people, in fact, it creates lots of inflammation in them. They get keto flu and all kinds of problems. The thing is, the ketogenic diet is not going to be a long-term solution for metabolic health, because one of the effects of the ketogenic diet is it changes the microbiome, right? All of those critical bacteria that protect for the long term against metabolic syndrome, things like Akkermansia, bifidobacteria, fecalum bacteria, they all need plant-based carbohydrates. They feed off of resistant starches and fiber. And so even though you can do ketogenic for a period of time and get some quick accelerated weight loss, it's not going to become a long-term solution. Eventually, it'll actually create more problems. And to me, one of the reasons why ketogenic diet gives you such a good short-term impact on your metabolic health is that a lot of people that switch to ketogenic diet are basically replacing sugars and simple carbs with fat, right? So they are actually, because they're going from eating bread and carbohydrates and all that to then replacing it with fat. And a lot of the benefit may be coming from just that reduction in sugar and simple carbohydrates itself, right? So I would say if you've got patients or you have had success with using the ketogenic diet, you can absolutely use it to jumpstart their weight loss and changes, but you need to go back into adding in prebiotics and probiotics, because that change in the microbiome over time will cause more problems.
Okay. Of course. So there is another question from Melania. She said that if short-chain fatty acids become available with the breakdown of bones in chicken bone broth, will this help with obesity?
So is she asking, will it be available from breakdown in bone?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not aware of bone or bone broth providing any significant amount of short-chain fatty acids. So things like ghee and butter and some animal fat, some components of the animal fat, and organ meat can provide some short-chain fatty acids, but I'm not aware of bone in itself being able to provide short-chain fatty acids. Now, some bacteria and some individuals can actually convert proteins to short-chain fatty acids. That's possible. That metabolic change is possible. So you can get short-chain fatty acids from the proteins in your diet as well, not anywhere close to the amounts that you get from resistant starches, oligosaccharides, fiber, and so on. But I'm not aware of short-chain fatty acids coming from bone breakdown itself.
So, thank you. Dr. Fernando is asking if, are there also any studies on LPS affecting cortisol?
LPS affecting what, sorry?
Cortisol.
Calcitol, I'm not familiar with what that is.
Cortisol.
Cortisol. Mm-hmm.
Cortisol.
Oh, cortisol. Sorry. Yes. Yes. Stress hormone. Absolutely. So when you have an increase in endotoxemia, when you have increased circulating levels of LPS, you actually get an increase in epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol response. So in fact, LPS, elevated circulating LPS, is associated with elevated stress hormone expression. And then also that follows with an increase in things like interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and other inflammatory mediators as well. So increased LPS in circulation does cause increase in stress hormone release.
Okay. Okay. Also, what products do you recommend for prebiotics and for probiotics?
What products?
Products? Yes.
Products, yeah. So in our studies, we use our oligosaccharide-based product called MegaPre. MegaPre is a mix of 4 different oligosaccharides. It is 2 fructose oligosaccharides that come from kiwi fruit. They are specifically shown to increase akkermansia and increase fecalum bacteria. Fecalum bacteria is really important because it's a big protector of the barrier structure in the gut lining. So it really helps a leaky gut. And then it's got the xylo-oligosaccharide, which is the XOS, which really increases bifidobacteria levels. And then it also has the galacto-oligosaccharides, GOS, which increases butyrate short-chain fatty acid levels. So that's a product called Mega Prebiotic. So we do our research work with that particular product. And then the spore-based probiotic that we use is the spore-based probiotic that we work with both in clinic and in research, which is called Mega Spore Biotic. So it's a 5-strain spore probiotic formula.
Okay. Also, Dr. Fernando is asking if there evidence of better results combining probiotic intake and fasting to repair gut leak and reduce insulin resistance?
Was that a better result with adding in fasting?
Yes.
Is that the question? Yeah. Okay. So I'm not aware of a study that combines both probiotics and fasting. However, there's lots of studies on fasting itself. And of course, fasting is one really potent thing you can do for improved metabolic health. When you think about the mechanisms of action of how fasting helps and then how these probiotics and prebiotics help, I would think that it would be additive, because one of the things that fasting does is it helps increase akkermansia levels. Right, so that's a beneficial effect of fasting, and akkermansia, of course, has all of these metabolic improvements. Fasting can also increase the production of short-chain fatty acids over time, so it has a similar effect that probiotics and prebiotics tend to have as well. So I would think combining them would actually be an additive effect. I've not seen a study where they've done probiotics with fasting, but in my personal life, I fast every day. I've been fasting, doing intermittent fasting probably for the last 4 years. I do a 16-hour fast every day where I basically, after dinner, I stop eating. And of course, I don't eat till lunch the next day. So I'm mostly skipping breakfast. And I could say for me, doing that fasting and then, of course, adding in the probiotics and prebiotics has been a tremendous help in maintaining a certain degree of body mass, especially when I travel so much and I don't get to exercise and eat properly. It's been a big help. Oh, I can't hear you, Patricia.
Are you going to ask, Karen?
Thank you for all the information. I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary to give supplementation with omega-3 in obesity and leaky gut?
I think it can be beneficial, especially if you have a high EPA omega fatty acid. The EPA component is more critical for metabolic health and leaky gut than the DHA. The DHA will actually end up in the brain and other parts to help the rest of the body. EPA is really critical. One of the reasons why it is really impactful is it brings down what we call the EPA arachidonic acid ratio. Arachidonic acid is a significant pro-inflammatory pathway that is turned on when the gut lining gets damaged. And that inflammation actually can damage the gut lining more and more. And so if you can have a high EPA fish oil, that can be really beneficial in metabolic health in general.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Perfect. So, in the last question, do you recommend a microbiome gut protocol to all of these patients?
Yes. So what we do is we tend to start them with the prebiotic-probiotic combination before we make any diet adjustments or exercise regimen, right? And the reason is because we find that when you take an individual that has had a certain type of lifestyle and habit, it's so hard to get them to change the next day. So what we say is, okay, the first step is the easiest step. All you do is you take this probiotic and prebiotic combination and then just continue to eat the way you eat, right? And what we tend to find is within the first 2 weeks or so, the amount of food that they eat actually decreases. And the reason for that is the satiety signals start working better, right? The ghrelin-leptin combination starts automatically working better. So that without even knowing it, they actually start reducing the amount they eat. And then they'll start feeling actual weight coming off. Their energy levels will change. And then because of those changes, they become a lot more motivated to accelerate the change, because then they start seeing that this is possible, right? So then they come in week 3, week 4, and what we do is we start adding in some minor changes to the diet. We increase a little bit their fiber intake, decrease a little bit the caloric intake. We might add in 1 or 2 days of like a 15-minute exercise routine, nothing dramatic at all. And then we slowly baby step that up. what we tend to find over time is because we're making a fundamental change in their gut microbiome, we are turning their gut microbiome from looking like an obese individual's gut to a skinny person's gut. When they eventually lose the weight that they want to lose, they tend to keep it off because their microbiome is now different. They have the microbiome of a skinny person, right? And so they don't have the same struggles that they had before. So it's a slower, longer process, but metabolically, it's far more effective. And also, you'll start to see all of these changes in their other endpoints, things like triglyceride levels, cholesterol levels, hypertension. You'll start to see changes in inflammatory mediators. All of these other indicators of health will start changing as well. So that's kind of the approach we take.
Okay, perfect. So, Kiran, thank you a lot. And I hope we can have a next time with you to learn and to continue learning.
Thank you. And we have a very exciting array of speakers this year. They're going to be talking about clinically relevant things associated with the microbiome that you really won't hear from any other conference. And I personally curate all of the speakers and the topics, and I work with the best researchers in this space. So we're very excited to be able to bring them. I would love to see more people attending from your community.
Okay, so perfect. Thank you a lot. Pura vida, Kiran.
Pura vida. Buenas noches.
Okay.
Thank you.
Buenas noches.
Buenas.